Thank you so much for having me here, Blake, and everyone. I really appreciate this wonderful turnout. So I'm calling in from Westchester County, New York. I live in Mamaroneck. I'm an assistant professor of sports studies at Manhattanville University, which is in Purchase, New York, which is in basically central Westchester, almost to Connecticut, about 45 minutes north of New York City. I have a PhD in history from Temple University. And Blake, actually, your little feeder question there, I was trying to remember when I first got a SABR membership, and it must have been during graduate school. But my dad was a SABR member, so I just always remember SABR research journals lying around our house, so it feels like I've always been a SABR member. Um, and I came to this topic. This is not what I went to grad school to do. I've been a baseball fan my whole life, but I went to grad school to study conscientious objection in the United States during World War One, which is a very different topic. And I wrote a paper on that, and then I realized there wasn't much more than about 30 pages that I could write on that because there were something like 2,800 conscientious objectors in the United States to World War One, and I had sort of explored all the things I could explore. But then I took a class on consumer culture history, and I took a class on food history, and I started to think about where they intersected. And as a baseball fan, I immediately started thinking about ballpark hot dogs. So I started with writing about food at ballparks and expanded out to the totality of the fan experience. And that is how I ended up with this book, but also with a job in sports studies as opposed to a job in a traditional history department. So I'm going to talk for about 20, 25 minutes probably. And then I'd be really excited to take your questions and have a nice conversation about all this. So this is little bits of excerpts from my new book, Bleacher Seats and Luxury Suites, Democracy and Division at the 20th Century Ballpark. It technically comes out at the end of the month, but what I can do right now is pull a copy off the shelf right next to me. So for those of you who can see, I actually physically have my book, which is so exciting because I've been waiting a long time for this. So if you put in an order for this, it will show up very soon because even though it's not technically published yet, it is shipping. So with that, I'm going to start reading some excerpts from my book. With 2 outs in the top of the 5th inning of a Wednesday, April 29th, 2015 game between the Baltimore Orioles and the visiting Chicago White Sox, White Sox batter Michael Johnson grounded a ball to Orioles second baseman Ray Navarro, who fielded it and threw it to first baseman Chris Davis for a force out. Davis, as first basemen often do at the end of an inning, casually tossed the ball into the stands. On this occasion, however, Davis did not bother to pick out a particular fan for the souvenir, because on that day, 5 years before the COVID-19 pandemic made such situations shockingly normal, there were no fans in the ballpark. 17 days earlier, Baltimore police had arrested 25-year-old Freddie Gray on spurious charges. The previously healthy Gray emerged from a 45-minute ride in the back of a police van, a ride in which he was shackled but not permitted to use a seatbelt, in a coma and with severe spinal damage. Gray never retained consciousness and died a week later. Baltimore residents, angered by years of racist policing, demanded justice. On Saturday, April 25th, activists marched and rallied outside Baltimore City Hall. City police monitored their activities closely, but without an overwhelming presence of uniformed officers. Following the rally, the marchers headed downtown. Their path took them directly past Oriole Park at Camden Yards, the Orioles' home ballpark, that when it opened in 1992 was a trend-setting facility, in part because unlike its predecessors, it was situated adjacent to downtown. As the activists neared the park, large numbers of uniformed officers materialized to prevent them from getting close to it, leading one protester to yell that the police, quote, only care about the Orioles. When the marchers continued on their path, they encountered baseball fans, many of whom were there to root for the Orioles' opponents, the Boston Red Sox. As they had all along their route, outside the bars surrounding Camden Yards, the protesters chanted justice for Freddie Gray. Drunken Red Sox fans, presumably few of whom lived in Baltimore, chanted back, we don't care. The crowds mixed and fights broke out, including one between a heavyset white man in his 50s wearing a National Police Week jacket and a black man with long braids wearing an Orioles jacket. Photographs showed overwhelmingly white bar patrons and overwhelmingly black protesters, demonstrating a stark contrast between the people who lived in the city and those who came into it to drink and be entertained by the national pastime. A journalist later explained that in the ensuing hours, quote, some teenagers and young men smashed in police cruisers' windshields and bar windows and looted a 7-Eleven. Throughout the game, police helicopters circled near the ballpark. With the score tied at 4 in the ninth inning, and in order to protect some of the very same fans who had instigated the fights that preceded the property damage, the mayor and the city police ordered the 36,757 fans at the game to remain in Camden Yards. Photographs of fans standing inside locked ballpark gates showed a predominantly white crowd. As journalist Dave Zirin wrote, if fans had been permitted to exit at that time, they would have had to confront, quote, the reality that a young man who did not look all that different from some of the people they were cheering on the field was killed a short Uber ride away. By the time the Orioles won the game in the bottom of the 10th on a walk-off home run, the city had lifted the order and allowed fans to leave, but told them to avoid Howard Street north of the ballpark and Harbor Place to its east. Soon thereafter, the team offered free tickets to anyone who had been in the park that night because, as they explained, those fans, quote, may not have had the premier Oriole Park experience that we strive to achieve. The following afternoon's game went off without a hitch, but in the wake of Gray's funeral on Monday morning, some grieving Baltimoreans again turned to property destruction. The Chicago White Sox were scheduled to make their only visit to Baltimore to play a 3-game series starting that evening. With police stationed around the ballpark, the light rail shut down north of the park, and only 2 of the park's gates open, a little more than 45 minutes before the 7:05 p.m. first pitch, Major League Baseball postponed the game. Baseball Commissioner Rob Manfred explained that, quote, we feel like we made the decision that will provide us the greatest possible security in terms of protecting the fans, the players, the umpires, everybody involved in the game. Late Tuesday morning, the Orioles announced that that night's game was also postponed. Wednesday's game would be played at 2 instead of 7 to ensure it would be over before the city's 10 p.m. curfew, and no fans would be permitted to attend. Manfred explained that, quote, all the decisions in Baltimore were driven first by the desire to ensure the safety of players, fans, umpires, and stadium workers. The Orioles manager made the point even clearer, noting that, quote, the last thing you want to do is put the fans in harm's way. The team announced that the postponed games from Monday and Tuesday would be made up as a doubleheader in late May, and that the Tampa Bay Rays, who were scheduled to come to Baltimore for a 3-game series starting Friday, would instead host the Orioles at their ballpark in Florida. Understanding why the Orioles hosted a game in an empty ballpark requires looking much further back than early April 2015. Tracing the history of the fan experience at MLB ballparks shows that while throughout the 20th century the ballpark was often described as an egalitarian place, the experience there was built on exclusion and division. The nature of this exclusion and division changed over the course of the 20th century, becoming more covert in some ways and more visible in others, as social norms, cities, and leisure consumption patterns changed. Consistently, however, the fan experience privileged middle and upper-class white men by centering their experience and the vision of America it represented around their needs, desires, and perspectives, and making sure they felt safe and secure at the ballpark. Middle and upper-class white men made up the majority of people in the ballpark during the 20th century, and to many of them, the experience there felt inclusive and egalitarian. At games, fans passed hot dogs to strangers in the middle of a row of seats. They stood up collectively so someone could dash to the restroom between innings. And they rooted for the home team together with people they did not know. Although these actions had nothing to do with voting or governance, because they made people feel like equal members of a community that was not explicitly restricted by race, class, or gender, many fans saw them as democratic acts.
Could you make
half a cup of coffee?
Moreover, aside from which team they cheered for and which players they booed, fans in other cities participated in the same rituals. Although there were some regional differences in the fan experience, its continuity, and Thomas, can you mute yourself, please?
Oh, sorry.
Although there were some regional differences in the fan experience, its continuity and what fans saw and did at ballparks tells an important story, not just about how fans thought about the ballpark experience and urban spaces, but also how they felt about the nation as a whole. Bleacher seats and luxury suites is a history of changes in the in-person MLB fan experience that explains why and when those changes happened and what they tell us about broader society and about people's hopes, fears, tastes, and prejudices. It examines the fan experience primarily through 5 important and trend-setting ballparks, which shaped and reflected the experience at other facilities. Those ballparks are the Polo Grounds and Yankee Stadium in the first half of the 20th century, or the classic ballpark era, Dodger Stadium and the Astrodome from the 1950s to the 1980s, the multi-use ballpark era, and Camden Yards in the retro chic ballpark era, the 1990s and beyond. Even as both changed, ballparks and the baseball played in them often seemed timeless to fans. For more than 100 years, 3 strikes man and out, 4 balls a walk, and 9 innings a complete game. Yet new pitches, new rules, new players, and new strategies abounded. Crowd descriptions also offered an element of timelessness, though teams frequently remodeled and rebuilt their ballparks. Across the 20th century, observers regularly framed the crowd as a diverse representation of America, implying that fans were equal members of a larger community and that the ballpark was equally accessible to all, although that was never truly the case for women, people of color, and poorer fans. For example, in 1909, progressive reformer Jane Addams saw fans at the park as, quote, lifted out of their individual affairs and so fused together that a man cannot tell whether it is his own coat or another's that he is wildly waving to celebrate a victory. Adams concluded that the fan, quote, does not call the stranger who sits next to him brother, but he unconsciously embraces him in an overwhelming outburst of kindly feeling when the favorite player makes a home run. Though she referred to fans as male, she asked, quote, does this not contain a suggestion of the undoubted power of public recreation to bring together all classes of a community in the modern city? Similarly, in 1912, a writer for Baseball Magazine argued that the fan is, quote, the representative American institution. His ranks are filled from every class of society, by every one of the many nationalities which combine to make the American nation. 2 months later, journalist Hugh Fullerton called baseball, quote, the most democratic sport in the world, and in stand and bleachers, all are equal during a hard game. Again, emphasizing the seeming equality of male fans, in 1935, Meyer Berger wrote in the New York Times that, quote, at the height of his frenzy, the rooter knows no class distinction. The taxi driver or garbage handler will sock the banker or broker in fraternal enthusiasm when the home team slugger belts one over the wall. The meek, inhibited bookkeeper rises to rare altitudes of scorn and vituperation in arguing the fine points of the game with the stiffish tycoon in the adjoining seat. And the unemployed dishwasher from the Bronx sounds his native tone of derision when the Park Avenue penthouse dweller on his left doesn't happen to share his views in matters pertaining to baseball. In the ballpark, every man's a king. In 1988, author Peter Golenbach wrote, quote, black, white, Christian, Jew, Hindu, Muslim, gay or straight, pro-abortion, pro-life, the disparate interest groups agree on little, except for their love of the national pastime. Despite observers' assertions that baseball was inclusive and created a sense of community that many found to be democratic, by design, the ballpark was never a space where all fans were equals. Since their inception, professional baseball teams have always charged different prices for seats in different parts of the ballpark. Moreover, when Sunday baseball was illegal and all games were day games, as was the case in many northeastern cities into the 1920s and beyond, few working-class fans could go to games. In the 1960s, owners like Walter O'Malley of the Dodgers and Roy Hofheinz of the Astros introduced even more ways to separate fans, adding physical tiers and new ticket price levels to their ballparks. They also pioneered exclusive clubs that gave wealthy fans the option to further separate themselves from everyone else. Rarely, if ever, were women described as true fans, and the methods owners employed to attract them were often demeaning. By the 1990s, one fan felt that, quote, the common man was left out of the ballpark because we can't get tickets or won't go because we don't feel welcome. Like that fan in the 1990s, other observers increasingly commented on inequalities in the ballpark experience. In 1996, urban planner Edward Blakely claimed that, quote, it used to be the regular guy at the ballpark could sit next to the corporate CEO. Not anymore. The next year, Frank DeFord argued that, quote, not even a cynic could ever deny the essential democracy that was always the most magical and defensible element of popular sport. The arena made for a grand public convocation, a 20th century village green where we could all come together in common excitement. Of the most recent vintage, though, luxury boxes, often as not enclosed behind glass, have so insulated the swells from the hoi polloi that it is fair to say that the American Sports Palace has come to boast the most stratified seating arrangement in entertainment. While some scholars have noted the inequalities in retro-chic ballparks, because they did not fully examine how difficult it was for many poorer fans and fans of color to get to multi-use era stadiums. They have suggested that ballparks in the 1960s and 1970s were relatively accessible and egalitarian places. For example, in 2012, philosopher Michael Sandel argued that, quote, for the most of the 20th century, ballparks were places where corporate executives sat side by side with blue-collar workers, where everyone waited in the same lines to buy hot dogs or beer, and where rich and poor alike got wet if it rained. In the last few decades, however, this has changed. The advent of skybox suites high above the field of play has separated the affluent and privileged from the common folks in the stands below. What these scholars and commenters saw as decreased egalitarianism in the retro chic era was as much an increase in the visibility of the barriers to full access to the fan experience that had always existed as it was to anything else. In other words, to many white male fans, the demographic of people most often, but not exclusively, making claims about the inclusive nature of the fan experience, ballparks of the 1990s and 2000s felt less egalitarian because the barriers and segmentation that had not impacted them in previous eras were modified to become more visible and to have an impact on their ballpark experience. As journalist Michael Farber acknowledged when he wrote the quote, the infernal skybox creates a gap more dispiriting than box seats ever did, it was not that the barriers were new, it was that they were easier to see. Bleacher seats in luxury suites argues that at baseball games, exclusion, both from the ballpark entirely and from the totality of the fan experience, were masked by rhetoric about the crowd and the relative lack of explicit policies barring anyone from attending. Instead, team executives built a system that was economically and socially stratified, and over the course of the 20th century, increasingly physically distant from people of color and poorer Americans. Throughout, women were marginalized at the park. Moreover, ballparks' physical tiers allowed wealthier fans to pay more to sit where they would not have to interact with poorer fans. That type of division gave middle and upper class fans a space that felt comfortable and safe because it was anything but truly accessible to all Americans, yet importantly retained the appearance of inclusivity because the barriers to attendance were covert. Places like ballparks that were supposedly open to everyone, but due to cost, location, and a lack of welcoming atmosphere for some Americans were not truly open to all, allowed the patrons who could more easily access them to conceive of a nation composed almost exclusively of people like themselves. As fans internalized the rhetoric that cast ballparks as sites representing the totality of America, saw mostly middle and upper class white men when they looked around them, and read descriptions of female fans depicting them as inferior and different, they were likely to center middle and upper class white men in their understanding of the nation. Even as cities in the country changed, ballparks reified the privileged position of middle and upper class white men as the normative American citizen. Bleacher seats in luxury suites also argues that teams had to change their ballparks' images and tinker with how fans could access them and how they were divided inside them, when fans' tastes and their visions of what a city should look and feel like changed. Team officials modified ballparks' designs to maintain the feeling of inclusion built on structural discrimination that was fundamental to the fan experience. Although owners always employed different ticket prices for different areas of the park, and often separated those sections with metal railings, as barriers that made it harder for working class fans to attend lessened, and cities began to feel out of control to many middle and upper class white people, owners added more physical and financial divisions at the park. From the 2 main tiers at the Polo Grounds, to the 3 at Yankee Stadium, to the 5 at Dodger Stadium, and the 7 at the Astrodome, the more fans could afford to pay, the more distance from the masses they could choose to purchase. Those tiers helped owners to achieve their main goal as capitalists, attracting larger and larger crowds to bolster their profits. The physical divisions allowed fans who, for example, wanted to take in a game as a family, to be in the same ballpark as a group of friends celebrating a 21st birthday without the two groups coming into conflict. They gave fans the option to sit in sections of the ballpark where the majority of people would act in accordance with or be accepting of behaviors stereotypically associated with certain socioeconomic classes. Tiers allowed owners to create a mass audience of people who had contrasting views of what a day at the ballpark should entail. They diffused tensions between groups by shielding one from another. Bias, prejudice, and structural discrimination, however, complicated owners' quests to increase attendance and maximize profits. Racism, sexism, and classism made it more difficult for some people to attain the knowledge necessary to follow every pitch, exhibit great understanding of the game, and therefore be a traditional fan. It was not impossible for women, people of color, and members of the working class to become traditional baseball fans, but there were barriers, including the way they were described or hurdles they faced to playing the game as children, that made it more difficult for people from marginalized communities to become incorporated into traditional fandom. For team executives, one of the consequences of those barriers was that they could not satisfy their cravings for increased revenue only through appeals to traditional fans. Moreover, keeping marginalized communities out of traditional fandom appealed to many traditional fans. Therefore, owners aimed to appeal to people interested in other types of entertainment to attract more fans, while trying not to undermine the social hierarchy of traditional fandom. To draw those people and extract more money from their wealthiest fans, team executives created exclusive luxury suites, restaurants, and clubs that, as they proliferated, also served as visible symbols that most people did not have full access to the totality of the fan experience. In other words, the very structures that privileged middle and upper class white male fans eventually meant that more visible barriers to the fan experience were necessary for team owners to reap the profits they demanded. Although tiers and restricted access sections allowed owners to make more money and protected fans from one another, to provide fans the sense of safety they desired, owners had to shift the location of their facilities and alter the barriers that made it harder for some people to attend games. In the first quarter of the 20th century, owners built ballparks on the edges of cities where they could afford land, but also where mass transit lines ran so that carless fans, the vast majority in this era, could easily reach them. As the decades progressed, the areas around many of these ballparks developed into middle-class neighborhoods, often populated by the very fans who frequented games. Owners did not need to protect fans from the city in the first half of the 20th century because many fans were the same people who lived there, and structural barriers limited the number of working-class people who could attend games. Barriers that made it more difficult, but not impossible, for some fans to attend included the cost of tickets and the timing of games during regular working hours. As white flight and suburbanization changed the demographics of cities after World War II, the neighborhoods around a number of ballparks became poorer and less white. Many of the middle and upper class white fans who frequented baseball games no longer lived near ballparks. Instead, they lived in suburbs where they relied on automobiles for transportation. Many fans in the 1950s wanted to feel protected from the kinds of people who populated neighborhoods around ballparks. At the same time, however, overt racism and classism were increasingly socially unacceptable. So owners aimed to give fans the feeling of safety they wanted by having them drive to games and park in well-lit parking lots around new modernist stadiums, often in different cities altogether, rather than explicitly bar anyone. The structural discrimination at these new post-war ballparks worked similarly to how it did in the suburbs, which also felt representative of the nation while maintaining their exclusivity. Multi-use era stadiums were more difficult for working-class fans and fans of color to access than their predecessors because they were often poorly served by mass transportation. The increase in physical tiers at the multi-use era stadiums created new financial barriers to full access to the fan experience that functionally recreated racial and class segregation and reinforced a similar notion of who was fully welcomed to the one that had existed at classic era ballparks. Suburban-style ballparks, however, lost their luster in the eyes of many by the 1990s. The comfort, safety, and modernism that had drawn fans to those ballparks in the 1960s was uninspiring to a new generation. Driving along highways to get to concrete donut stadiums did not seem to provide the experience that fans wanted. To many, baseball had lost its timelessness and needed to return to its urban past and its architectural roots. Much as they had when classic era ballparks were in vogue, fans did not actually want to patronize spaces that were open to everyone. They only wanted to go to ballparks that felt open to everyone. Starting in the 1990s, owners built new ballparks with municipal assistance in carefully controlled, highly regulated urban spaces. Those ballparks presented a facsimile of the past in an atmosphere that was effectively walled off from the parts of the city that made middle and upper class white fans that many middle and upper class white fans wanted to avoid. The greater number of skyboxes and the reduced total of cheap seats at these new facilities were more visible barriers to the full experience than many older ballparks had, but served to reproduce the crowd demographics of older ballparks. Throughout the 20th century, the fan experience was an important part of American society. Where that experience took place, who was involved, how fans got there, where they sat when they arrived, and how they behaved, tells us that middle and upper class white Americans wanted to spend their free time in spaces that felt inclusive, but were far from open to everyone. The fan experience, however, was designed not to remind middle and upper class white Americans that they had paid to be separated from others. Instead, that separation was made to feel natural. At ballparks, therefore, middle and upper class white Americans were not prompted to think about the limits of American democracy, making it harder for them to see those limits in other places as well. Thank you.
Anybody have a question jumping out at them or all? But Mike.
One, doesn't this seem to apply to all professional sports now? I mean, basketball, football, everybody has luxury boxes and tiers of seat pricing. And the second thing is this only applying to high-level professional sports? Because, like, I'm a minor league fan, and I don't see any of that here. In fact, our team here in Columbus has gone out of the way to keep ticket prices low. I mean, they've never raised the ticket price here since the stadium was opened in 2009 because they wanted to draw fans in. They've even got a wall outside where you can look in from the street for free. So, you know, is this just primarily a professional high-level issue, and does it apply to other sports?
Yeah, so appreciate that question. Absolutely, the current separation, luxury suites, exclusive spaces, etc., applies to other sports as well right now at the elite level. What's different about baseball is that those other sports don't have that same rhetoric of inclusivity and democratic access that are so fundamental to the ballpark experience. So that contrast between its myth and its reality is much, much starker for Major League Baseball. And it is lessened in minor leagues. And you all would know this far better than I would. Is the Columbus minor league team municipally owned?
It is.
That's a major difference. I think if you went to a minor league ballpark, especially a higher level minor league ballpark somewhere else, you would see more of that stratification. It's obviously lessened in the minor leagues because minor league teams are not making any revenue from, or substantial revenue from television, where these major league teams don't really care if they price you out, because if you're a fan, you're likely to purchase their expensive TV pass as well. So pushing you out of the ballpark doesn't quite matter as much for elite level teams as it does for the minor league teams, because there's not an additional revenue stream they can extract from you if you're not in the ballpark.
Seth, as money that was kind of driven from pretty expensive TV contracts that create a disparity between big markets and small markets. I'm wondering, I feel like that's the main culprit of the escalating salary structure that we have, and that in itself led to owners trying to find a way of paying for these escalated salaries. And I'm, probably unfairly blaming it on New York's and the LA's, but nonetheless, the trickle down is to these other things. That I see some of the stratification happening primarily because they wanted ways to make more money, and there was a market for people willing to pay for a better experience. I don't even know what my question is there.
Yeah, so I think you're looking, if I may say so, a little bit too present, because the stratification really starts long before free agency, long before there's any kind of salary escalation. It has hyper intensified in recent years, but its roots go all the way back to the beginning when the reserve clause was fully functional and really having an impact on player salaries. So I see what you're saying about the escalation now, and teams in New York and Los Angeles that have audiences around the world and can sell tickets for ridiculous sums of money that are functionally unaffordable. But that's also like small market teams are trying to copy as much of that as they can. So yes, it's more intense, at Dodger Stadium than at PNC Park, but you got to bet that the Pirates owners would love to be turning that kind of profit and extracting that kind of revenue from their fans in the same way. I think Karen, you have your hand up in the Zoom room.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Karen?
Yes, I had a question. I know that in 1883, they started the Ladies' Day. Could you kind of explain what happened and when it started and how it worked?
Yeah.
That was really good.
So that's a great question. I do write about that in the Polo Grounds chapter. I write about Ladies' Day.
Okay.
And there's not one neat story to tell about Ladies' Day because it was slightly different in all of the different ballparks, right? They function slightly differently. But the general idea, especially in the 1880s when it got started, was that if they invited women into the ballpark, then male fans would control themselves better. That the presence of women would make male fans not drink as much, not fight as much, not curse as much, and therefore the players on the field would not be inspired to yell at the umpire, curse, get in fights, etc. And the way that they induced women to come to the ballpark was that women were either admitted for free or they were admitted for free if accompanied by a paying male fan. But those Ladies' Days tickets were not in the bleachers where the rowdy men were. The Ladies' Days tickets were exclusively in the grandstand. So there's this inherent class division there. And one of the other things that they wanted to do by attracting women was to market as clearly a middle-class space in contrast to bare-knuckle boxing, for example, which was also an extremely popular sport in the 1880s, where it was totally inappropriate for middle-class women to be. But if they could get middle-class women into the ballpark, then they could market themselves as this middle and upper-class sport. They could get those fans that they wanted. They could improve the reputation of Major League Baseball. And Ladies' Days sort of go in and out of fashion over the next 80 years. There are times when Major League Baseball restricts them because visiting teams aren't getting a portion of the ticket revenue that they should be getting because there are people entering the park for free. The Cubs have to cap the number of Ladies' Days tickets they can offer because too many women are coming to the ballpark and men who wanted to pay can't get in.
Okay.
But the marketing in the 20th century of Ladies' Day casts women as, among other things, completely and utterly ignorant of baseball, which is just incorrect and super offensive. It casts them as ruining the experience of the male fans who bothered to show up on ladies' days by being ignorant, by being women in what is supposed to be a male space. And it claims, falsely, that women are only there to find male romantic partners, either other fans or players. So the ads, and I wish I could show you this right now, right? The ads for Ladies' Day in New York in the 30s and 40s is little cartoons that would appear in the paper of like women batting eyes at Joe DiMaggio. And that clearly, yes, women are welcomed into that space, but only in this subordinate role of you're not a real fan. Your interest in the game is not as authentic, and you're actually kind of annoying. But like, we'll take your money, but you're kind of annoying. And that's what I mean by exclusion from the full experience, right? They're not barred in any way, but they're absolutely not treated the same.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Stan, I see your hand too.
Yeah, hi, Seth. Interesting topic. One thing I don't know if you touched on or not, maybe you did in the book, I haven't quite got there yet, was the proliferation of the baseball villages where teams are buying up the surrounding lands. I know Atlanta did it, and I think they did it in Washington. How does that affect? Does that make it worse? Does that include more people? How does all that work?
Yeah, so I write about, what the heck is it called now? Wherever the Braves play. I write about that in the epilogue. Truist, thank you. I write about that in the epilogue. And they're not the innovators of it exactly. So Washington, it's a little bit different. The gentrification of that neighborhood, of the sort of Navy Yard area in D.C., that's the section of Southwest that's on the other side of the Anacostia. That started before that ballpark was built, and it kind of accelerated by the ballpark, but that was happening anyway. In St. Louis, that's really where I sort of see the origins of that ballpark village, and it was absolutely not inclusive. So for one, and I write about this a little bit in an article that I wrote a couple years ago. One, the Cardinal Stadium is consciously sort of modeled and trying to create nostalgia about Sportsman's Park. And Sportsman's Park was the only Major League Baseball stadium with formally segregated seating. Black people could not sit in the grandstands at Sportsman's Park until 1944. So any nostalgia that is in that current iteration of Busch Stadium that is referring back to Sportsman's Park is referring back to a stadium that was formally segregated. Coincidentally, it's St. Louis. This was not super surprising, but the site where that ballpark is located was where enslaved people were once sold. Like there was a slave auction on the site of where that ballpark is. But more tellingly, perhaps, when that ballpark village opened, it had like dress codes. I don't know how to describe this, but if you were wearing pants that were too baggy or your pants were too low and your boxers could be seen, you were not permitted in the ballpark village. So that's clearly coded to exclude people who dress a certain kind of way. So these villages in that sense are not really inclusive. And if you look in Atlanta, that is absolutely not a mass transit accessible place. And the language that the Braves used to explain the move is coded basically to say we're moving to where most of our season ticket holders are, right? And that suburb that they moved to is, something like 90% white, whereas where they were located in Atlanta was a heavily black neighborhood. And although the Braves used coded language, they talked about safety, they talked about where our fans are. Some of those fans, convenient for my research at least, wrote letters to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution that basically said, we got to move away from a mass transit accessible ballpark because the people who take mass transit are criminals. So it's not more exclusive, but the teams love it because they're, instead of just getting access to the real estate that is physically where their ballpark is at reduced or no tax, which was what happened, in the 70s and when the ballpark started to get redeveloped in the 90s. What they're also getting is additional land around it that they control entirely, that they have revenue streams from that will bring in revenue year round, and comes with the same, whatever tax abatement or whatnot they're getting for the ballpark also applies to these mixed use things around it. So they're getting lots of money at low taxes that is sustainable even when their team is no good. So the Braves, for example, which I enjoyed as a Phillies fan, they were terrible last year. It's great. Love it when the Braves are bad. They made a huge, they saw their revenue spike despite being terrible on the field because they have all this other ancillary things around the ballpark.
So what can the average fan do? Do we have any?
That's a really good question. What can the average fan do? You can start small, right? What's the saying? Like, think global, act local. Make baseball more welcoming in your own baseball experiences, right? Invite people to watch games with you. Build up encourage more municipalities to own their minor league teams, like in Columbus, right? Where they're going to leave those prices low because it's owned by the municipality. As an individual people, we can only, in this sense, fighting against literal billionaires, right? We can only do this very small local thing, right? If you it's sort of thinking about Karen's question, right? Like sitting next to, as a male fan, sitting next to a female fan at the ballpark, right? Don't assume ignorance, right? Think about those stereotypes, right? Like, don't assume that the female fan is there because their male partner dragged them along. And if you read accounts of female fans like Stacey May Fowles, who wrote a book, came out almost 10 years ago now, where she would often drag her male partner. She's a diehard baseball fan. Her male partner doesn't, her husband doesn't really care. And people would assume that he was the fan and she was just coming along. So I think that there's that sort of micro level that we can do to make baseball feel more accessible, make it actually be more accessible, and that can potentially cascade into bigger changes.
Very good. Thanks, Seth.
Thank you. There was a question in the chat. I grew up in Philadelphia, Tony.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
This is less of a question, more seeking a comment. When you talk about accessible areas, do you write in your book about the difference between Chicago's, guaranteed rate ballpark and Wrigley? I feel like it's never more apparent. A different neighborhood, different demographic. I feel like it is most prevalent in those two cities, despite both of them really having access with their loops, with their public
with
transportation.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask for a comment on that because that's where I notice it the most.
Yes. So obviously, there is a huge demographic difference between Wrigleyville and where the White Sox are located. And I have taken the L to both of those ballparks. It's a little bit easier to Wrigley. You don't have to walk through a parking lot or across that giant elevated bridge thing between the L and the ballpark. That, as someone who's not a huge fan of heights, was a little weird. And I think that really represents, there's also a wild difference between the management and the ownership of those two teams, but it does represent the ways that the neighborhoods around ballparks can influence the desirability of being there and who that core audience of Major League Baseball fans have been for so long and what spaces they seem more comfortable in. Yeah, obviously the 121 loss White Sox are not going to draw, but even when the White Sox are pretty good, they don't draw the way the Cubs do because there's that different vibe, that different feeling around the ballpark that does speak to a lot to what I talk about in the book, even though I don't talk about Wrigley Field or Rate Field or whatever the heck it's called now. It's gone through too many names for me to keep track of.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, you had said that the different Mike book brought out the point that most sports now.
I'm sorry. Can you speak up a little bit more or move the iPad closer? I'm having a little trouble hearing.
But Mike talked about all sports having these prices that that make the experience less than egalitarian. And you said that one of the things was baseball had this pretense that it was egalitarian. So why do you think the other sports don't seem to have that kind of pretense?
Yeah. So one of the things is baseball is so associated with ideas of America, and one of those foundational ideas is that notion of democracy and equality before the law. So it's part of that. But for example, basketball develops primarily as an urban game. I mean, baseball is an urban game, right? But basketball is understood as an urban game. So its demographics are limited. Football comes about originally as a college game, right? So it's, when it becomes popular originally at the beginning of the 20th century, it's for elite college students. And then when it becomes popular as a pro game beginning in the 50s, it's for more of a working class crowd. It doesn't have that cross-class appeal to it and rhetoric to it because of sort of where it originates. And hockey is obviously very geographically limited. Boxing is not thought of as an elite sport. Horse racing is not thought of as a working class sport. So it's the rhetoric around baseball is just different based on when it became so popular and its close association with ideals about America.
I think some of that it came from the writers. Is that what? Do they write differently? And the writers of the different sports write differently than baseball writers?
Yes, they write differently about the crowd. The idea of baseball as baked into Americana, as being the American national pastime, as being coming out of this rural area. It's tied into agrarianism and all of these various elements that make the writers describe it differently. Its pace makes it different. It being outdoors makes it different. It being popular before the others, the other professional sports, makes it different as well.
And when I read the summary of your book, the first thing that came to my mind wasn't baseball, but the Super Bowl. That the 52,000 people that paid $12.50 for the 1966 game would nowhere be seen in this year's game.
Yeah, and it's not something that is exclusive to baseball, these changes, obviously, right? This is endemic to the United States, this income inequality and this division. But I think it just comes through differently in baseball because of its history and because of its rhetoric.
Well, I have a question. Yeah. Thanks so much for your talk. This is Richard. I a lot to take in and to process. One thing I kept running through my mind is when we're in even a professional baseball park. You mentioned that there is this weird, wonderful aspect of where you have this, I guess, kind of a false sense of egalitarianism, because you do share often with things. Really interesting things happen can happen, within your section, where you're seating. Whatever the price, that apart from the skyboxes and things that don't necessarily happen in other contexts. And so you feel like you're part of something that's a little bit broader than one's ordinary community. And I guess I was struck by a couple of years ago. I was at the Pirates home game on Pride Day, and it was amazing an amazing event. There were people that, it's a Pride Day, so people really came out and, wearing clothes that you don't necessarily wear on the street. And there was a very celebratory aspect, at least down, in the seats where we happened to be sitting at that time. And, part of me knew that this was all kind of a marketing ploy. It has to do, maybe there was some goodwill somewhere in management to decide if this would be a great thing to do, for the community. On the other hand, that it's, about selling tickets, trying to get brownie points, with some kind of community. But it was actually, in the fan experience, it was very good. It was a positive thing. And so my takeaway from your talk, I guess, is that you can take me down if you disagree. I think it's good to celebrate the things that we do feel positive about while we're in the park, having what we think is a rich experience. But we also need simultaneously to ask, well, who's not here, or be aware of who's not here. And as you were saying in your question, being careful about our assumptions about the people, sitting next to us, and being aware of, like, how did we get to the park, and what does that mean? And I guess that's not going to change anything that the corporate level of our being aware, but I think it is a way to mitigate this kind of bizarre world that all sports have. I also kept thinking about soccer in the UK, and how its ethos has been challenged by current corporate structures, and so it's a really rich, complicated, messy topic that you're exploring. And I look forward to diving into your book more carefully.
Well, thank you, Richard. I really appreciate that comment. And I think that your sort of conclusion about what we can do really echoes with my understanding here. And you were talking about Pride Night and that sort of awesome feeling of inclusion at this thing. I'm not going to assume that you're as crazy a baseball fan as I am, but inclusion at this thing that I love, right? To share this thing that I love with more people, with people who historically I understand haven't been welcome there, just makes me feel good. I feel so happy to be sharing this thing that I love with people who have faced barriers in the past. And the question to me is basically like, what can I do to make myself feel that good in this space at other times? How can I extend that to more people? How can I make this a welcoming space where people from all walks of life really can feel comfortable? So we can make that rhetoric, that Jane Addams wrote about in 1909 more true, right? What can we do to make that reality, and how can we do that? And it starts small, right? We don't, unless any of you happen to own Major League Baseball teams, which if so, pay me more money. We can't do that from the top down. We can only really do that from the bottom up. And yeah, your comments about Premier League soccer and the total inversion of soccer from a working class game to an elite game are astonishing. And in soccer, I think it's even more true, right? The Premier League comes around, they get huge TV contracts, and now they can get money from working class people just by tuning in, so they can focus the in-person experience on drawing in that elite audience. And it's, class in the UK functions differently than class in the United States. So maybe that's starker there than it is in the United States, but some of that is definitely also happening here.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I have something here. I'm Frank from New York. Most of the time when there's a program like this, the author posts his email. I would like to email him a couple of things concerning New York, but I haven't seen the email.
Sure, I will drop that in the chat right now.
Thank you.
So that's my work email. I'm probably more responsive to my work email than I ought to be. Um, so feel free to contact me.
Any other questions?
This book on Amazon.
Yeah.
Yes, so my book is on Amazon, but you can also purchase it from the University of Illinois Press. And I have a 30% off discount code that I will also drop in the chat right now. So you can get it, I believe, for cheaper if you buy it from the press. I'll drop in the press page for it as well. Give me just a
I
second.
actually included that in our chapters email message. So if you don't want to
Great.
write it down now, at least if you're getting my thing, and I'm going to keep it on there even after this. So I figured it would make people want to buy the book after hearing that. So I'll keep it on the newsletter as well. But for those who don't subscribe to the Columbus chapter, you heard it.
And you can, if you're on social media, you can follow me. I've got a website, SethTannenbaum.com. I'm on Instagram at Seth S. Tannenbaum, PhD, and Blue Sky at Seth S. Tannenbaum.
John?
Seth, what would be in your mind the best way going forward to change some of these things, improve things?
Yeah, I mean, it's got to start small, because I don't think it's conceivable. I mean, it starts small in two ways. It starts small in making more people feel welcomed at the ballpark individually. It starts small in trying to stop municipalities from just giving billionaire team owners tax abatements to build ballparks that aren't for everybody. It's so deeply baked in that it's really hard to undo.
Because isn't it true that most communities, when they say they're giving these breaks, that the team isn't really bringing that much money? It's more for pride, local pride.
Yes. So all of the economists that I've read who have not been paid by teams to create these studies, which is a pretty significant difference, right?
Yeah.
All of them say that this is a financial loss for the municipality, and that money could be spent more efficiently by literally just paying people to clean up trash or whatever, right? That it would have a larger economic impact on the community if we took that chunk of money and we said, okay, we're going to give you some make work jobs on municipal spaces around the city. But there is an undeniable element of regional pride, of that feeling of community, that in this era in which I can talk to you from a screen to a screen, we don't really get in the same way. But the question to me comes down to, what is the value of that feeling of community in comparison to the value of, I don't know, paying school teachers more money, or opening up more libraries, or, doing all sorts of making more bike lanes and making things environmentally cleaner, right? How do you compare and contrast that value? I am really aware of the community value and that sense of togetherness that can come from being in the ballpark together with other people you don't know. That's a real thing. It's a real feeling. But how do you compare that value to other potential uses of that money is something else.
And I think that it shows we really are willing to pay for entertainment. And I think in Columbus, when the hockey team is formed, and they vote on the ballot for the county to pay for the stadium, when that failed, Nationwide Insurance came up and built it. So we sort of took their bluff in a way. But I think that's the problem now. I mean, it used to be when I was younger, everyone in baseball would threaten to go to Tampa Bay if they didn't get what they wanted. Now there's a team there, they can't threaten anymore.
Oh, they still have Portland and Nashville and Charlotte and, Oakland again.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Seth, thank you very much. This was really enjoyable.
Thank you, Blake.
I'm anxious to read the book now, and I'm sure some others are. I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads in here.
Wonderful.
So, anyways, thank you. This really worked out great on pretty short notice.
Yeah.
Thanks for sending that note, and hope you get to do more of them.
Yeah, thank you. I've got a couple lined up, and I know some of you are in the New York area, so I'm hoping to speak in person with the New York SABR chapter. And I have if anyone is near Nyack, New York, on April 11th, I've got a meet and greet at Big Red Books in Nyack, New York, and you can always find where I'm going to be on the events section of my website, and who I'm going to be talking to. I post it all there.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, Seth.
Bye.
Adios.
Anybody online have any additional comments? We're going to talk a little bit about the upcoming conference. Just we're trying to get a feel for who locally is going to be going. Tom and Stan, you guys will probably be there.
Yep.
Stan, you're always there, so
No, not always, but
pretty good.
a lot. Yeah. A lot. Interesting thought he had, though. It's interesting. I think the Mudhens are in the same boat as the Clippers are, municipally owned. I've never put that together before, and that makes a whole lot of sense.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, makes a whole lot of sense. I mean, the Mudhen tickets are almost a steal. It's like $12. Can't beat it.
That's Columbus.
Yeah.
Larry, a question came to me when we were talking about municipally owned teams. Do you think the major league owners would allow any more of those to be created?
No.
It would seem, well, you know what the NFL has done, obviously. They've got a rule that won't allow another team to be like the Packers. But I'm wondering if the major league owners are much more comfortable in a situation where they're in control, as opposed to having the community be in control. I would kind of guess that there aren't going to be any more of those, but I was curious what people think. You know more about this than I do.
I think that was part of their big move 3 years ago, whenever they just took control. All right. Dan, Tom, thanks for calling in.
Thanks for having me, Blake.
All right.
Well, it was good hearing everyone's voices this early baseball season. Hope to see you guys in person soon.
All right. Sounds good. See you, fellas.
Be good.
All right.
Thanks.
Just making sure I didn't miss anything else in the chat room. Some thank yous. I did include the 30% discount in my email. I'm going to keep that part of the email again. Okay. And log out here.